In the wild year of 1995, the big, unpredictable Atlantic Ocean met Hurricane Roxanne, a storm that was just plain puzzling. It was number 17 in a line of storms that year, but it stood out like a riddle. You see, this hurricane had a mind of its own, taking a zigzag path that left weather experts and folks living by the coast scratching their heads. What made Roxanne even more special was how it transformed so quickly. It began as a regular old low-pressure system, but in the blink of an eye, turned into a fierce Category 3 hurricane, crashing into Cozumel, Mexico, with all its might. But that's not all. Roxanne's story gets even wilder when it crosses paths with the DLB 269 disaster. A story that's etched in history forever. Imagine 6 valiant divers trapped in a chamber, anxiously awaiting 3 days. They planned to leave the barge they were on, which was submerged in 160 feet of water, before Hurricane Roxanne struck it. They had a strange déjà vu experience that brought to mind a terrifying episode from 1991 when the DB-29 crashed into the South China Sea after being struck by a tornado, killing 4 divers. Moving forward to October 1995, those 6 divers encountered a similar situation on the DLB 216 at that time. In the Yucatan Peninsula, Hurricane Roxanne was heading directly their way. They couldn't help but reflect about their loved ones, their fellow divers, and the eerie recollections of the DB-29. It is a tale of bravery and survival against a hurricane that defied the laws of nature. DLB, or derrick lay barge, might not sound too exciting at first, but in the summer of 1995, it became the stage for Mitch FIFA's extraordinary journey. This colossal, flat-bottomed vessel, the DLB 269, was no ordinary barge. It was a specialized workhorse on a mission to lay down those massive oil pipes in the depths of the ocean. So, what exactly is a DLB, you wonder? Well, it's a derrick lay barge, a crucial piece of engineering equipment designed for a remarkable underwater task. These barge people aren't exactly renowned for their inventive naming abilities, though. Consider the DB-29, the aircraft that dove into the South China Sea. You see, it was number 29, and DB stands for derrick barge. When we travel back in time to Mitch's day, we find the DLB 269, also known as derrick lay barge number 269. These boats might not be particularly inventive, but they are essential to the world of underwater engineering adventures. So Mitch FIFA set out to join this amazing crew. A barge needs tugboats to position and move it because it lacks propulsion of its own. 2 tugboats, the Captain John and the Sea Bulk North Carolina, are joined by the 400-foot-long DLB 269. 6 of her 245-person crew are saturation divers, who work and live in extreme conditions for nearly a month at a time. The pipes must be joined and fastened to the ocean floor by the saturation divers. There, the pressure is almost 6 times more than what you and I would often encounter while relaxing on a beach sipping Mai Tais. They are operating in 160 feet of water, or around 50 meters deep. We all have nitrogen in our bodies. Around 3% of your body is nitrogen gas, which makes this information crucial. When you dive, as you descend more, the pressure rises and your body begins to take up more nitrogen. However, it only takes in nitrogen until the pressure of nitrogen inside your body equals the pressure outside. Therefore, your body has to absorb 6 times as much nitrogen if you dive down to 160 feet and experience water pressure that is almost 6 times greater than at the surface. Now, the nitrogen is not instantly absorbed. It takes some time. When you resurface, it also takes some time for your body to release the nitrogen. Decompression will actually take 3 to 4 days for these divers operating at 160 feet, and it must be done carefully by lowering the pressure a little bit at a time. Decompression illness, or in rare circumstances, explosive decompression, such as the accidents involving the back of dolphins, can occur if it is done too quickly. As Hurricane Roxanne approaches on October 10th, the divers are instructed to protect the job site. At 160 feet, divers Lee, Lloyd, and Rob Whaley finish their final turn underwater before ascending into the dive well. While the divers are climbing back up to the barge, the diving bell will will keep them under pressure. 4 additional divers are presently ready to begin decompression in a dive room on the barge when the bell is next connected to it. Mitch FIFA, a 40-year-old diver, Phil Richard, a 27-year-old man with a small child at home waiting for him, and Clay Horschel, another young diver, are present in the chamber. The 6 guys live in close quarters for a month at a time in the dive chamber, which is only 7 feet by 12 feet. 2 divers would always be in the water, therefore there would typically only be 4 divers in the chamber. Hurricane days separate us from Roxanne, who is currently moving at a speed of about 5 miles per hour, roughly equal to how quickly you and I can walk. Phil has a sinister thought as soon as he realizes the race has begun. Will I survive to see my newborn child again? If Roxanne gets them before they have finished their decompression and the barge sinks like the DB-29 did 4 years ago, then they can get locked inside the space and sink with the barge. All they can do for now is wait. As you can undoubtedly imagine, things are getting rather tense on deck. 245 people are dependent on the sea and the tugboats that care after them as Hurricane Roxanne approaches them. The sea is beginning to grow as the barge gets 60 miles offshore. Between August and October, when there is the greatest risk, is hurricane season. However, just because they are conceivable does not imply that they always do. However, like the crew of the DLB 269, the crew cannot withstand a cyclone. The tugboats are working together to raise the 8 anchors that hold the DLB 269 in position while she's laying pipe. It's a time-consuming and complex task that has to be well orchestrated and far more difficult in the treacherous seas. Their extensive planning is beginning to pay off. The anchors are almost all back on deck, the divers are in the process of decompressing, and the weather office has excellent news. Roxanne has turned and is moving away from DLB 269 in the direction of the northwest. The 239 crew members on board, including the divers, exhale in relief. The crews establish a restless routine as decompression progresses in order to keep themselves occupied while the weather improves. For almost 24 hours, Phil, Mitch, Lynn, and the other divers in the chamber hardly speak to one another. Phil keeps his thoughts on his wife and his newborn son. But now, the stress of sinking is starting to ease, and home seems that much closer, but his relief is short-lived. Roxanne bumps into a low-pressure area and reverses direction. She is now immediately approaching the barge rather than moving northwest along the coast. Phil, Mitch, and Len have no choice except to wait and pray that Roxanne won't strike before their decompression is over. It's a foregone conclusion now, and Phil is aware of this. Chuck Roundtree, the dive superintendent, agrees. Chuck and the management of the organization make the decision to try a quick decompression of the divers out of concern for the security of his divers. Roxanne won't hold out for the completion of decompression because they are out of time. They plan an experimental emergency decompression procedure with hyperbaric specialists. One of the diving specialists on the barge is named Siobhan. He has spent many years working with diving chambers on oil rigs and has witnessed a lot of his friends and co-workers have the bends as a result of their decompression not going as anticipated. He is aware that decompression sickness, also known as the bends, can cause major issues for divers, ranging from minor signs like skin bubbles to paralysis and even death. He is worried about receiving an emergency decompression treatment, but he is also aware that if Roxanne sinks the barge while they are still within the chamber, his pals Phil, Mitch, and Lynn could perish. The DLB 269 will weather the hurricane while being towed by its 2 support vessels. The barge captain Richard Lobb and the operations manager at headquarters decide, while other barges in the fleet have sought shelter in a protected bay at Carmen. A condition that results in a fine for each day of delay is part of the contract for the DLB 269 to lay pipes for an oil business. The corporation is attempting to prevent future delays because the contract is now $1.5 million in the negative. There is an extra source of concern for the divers inside the chamber. Contrary to popular belief, the decompression takes the longest during the final 10 feet. The divers may so gauge their progress towards exit when the chamber's pressure approaches that of the surface. But it's imperative to take your time. They have to wait longer as they come closer. They must maintain their cool and wait patiently for the hatch to pop while still riding the storm's waves. Then it explodes. The men successfully reach the surface. The divers and their 14-person support crew are greatly relieved by the rapid decompression's success. They don't experience the crippling consequences of severe decompression sickness. Therefore, everyone is safe. These men would have liked to have crawled out of the hatch and into the sunshine, but for the 6 divers, it would have been more like getting out of the pan and into the fire. They are surrounded by the raging storm. All of the DLB 269's crew members are currently on deck. If the barge collapses, they don't want to be trapped below deck, which is fortunate. On October 15th, in the late afternoon, it is becoming clear that the barge will sink as the back quarter of the vessel is filling with water. Step up onto a life raft is a common phrase among sailors. This means that you enter the life raft only after the boat has already sunk. Frequently, a crew abandons a boat with a life raft because they fear it will sink. A few days later, the boat is discovered to be afloat. In choppy waters, a life raft is a much worse option than the comparatively calm of a boat or a barge. However, it differs slightly for a larger vessel. When a big boat or barge sinks, it leaves behind a downstream or a vacuum. In fact, it will draw everything around it deeper and deeper into itself. Therefore, there is a delicate balance between avoiding its draw before it sinks and waiting to see if it sinks. Although the crew on board are in a panic, the barge commander does not order an evacuation. They begin to leave the barge by blowing up life rafts and jumping into the choppy waters. They must make an effort to determine when to jump. The decks typically rise 20 to 30 feet above the water, but when the barge crosses a surf, it can soar up to 50 or 60 feet. The bow is a little higher as the back quarter sinks. Veteran seaman Jim Vines locates Bill Richard and Mitch Feather, 2 of his mates. The 2 men are aware of Jim's fear. Jim admits he can't swim and pleads with them to watch over him. Naturally, the 2 divers, who are young, healthy, and used to being in the water, immediately take Jim under their care. The guys can hear the metal twisting as the ship begins to break up, and they realize it won't be long until she disappears beneath the waves. The 3 men walk over to the deck's edge and lean over the handrails to peer out at the rushing water. They slowly scale the handrail and take a position on the edge, waiting for the right moment to jump. When Phil and Mitch notice a surge approaching, they realize this is their opportunity. The countdown begins with 3, 2, 1. They dive down far below the surface of the ocean, some 40 feet away. With their heads below, they experience a bizarre period in which they are unable to hear the wind howling, the waves pounding against the barge, the twisted metal, or the terrified screams of the men. The men look for one another as they ascend back to the surface. "Where's Jim?" yells Phil to Mitch. They look everywhere in a panic, and then Mitch points up to the barge's deck. Jim is hanging to the guardrail because he is terrified of the water and decided not to go in. Jim ignores the cries of Phil, Mitch, and others to jump. He gives them not even a glance. Fear has rendered him helpless. Phil and Mitch are now forced to swim away from the sinking barge because they can't save their pal. Before the sinking vessel drags them down with it, they must evacuate the area. In the hopes that Jim will survive, they turn and swim away. On October 15, 1995, at around 1800, the barge almost silently sinks beneath the surface of the river. Hundreds of men are in the sea with Phil and Mitch as a storm rages all around them and night falls. Men are grabbing onto life rafts and other floating objects that they can. Phil is once more contemplating whether he would ever see his infant son again when something happens that terrifies him. The Captain John tugboat's bow falls down the opposite side of a seawall as it breaks the wave's crest. Phil can see the boat's propellers spinning out of the water as it appears to teeter on the wave. Phil is worn out, only just in time for them to have to jump from the barge's deck and swim for their life before being sucked down with it. He and Mitch emerged from emergency decompression. Just as they could feel the sense of hope to be plucked from the raging water, those hopes are dashed by the idea of being crushed by the very boat that could save them as it rolls over the waves and smashes into the sea, or worse, being chopped up by the propeller as it spins through the water. The Captain John tug is expertly steered by Captain Robert Trosclair through a sea of people and debris. The tugboat emerges from the sea and drives its bow into the wave's crest. By some miracle, Bill and Mitch manage to hold onto the tires that are resting on the side of the tug as she approaches. The two guys lift themselves over the side and into safety using their last remaining energy, along with assistance from the crew and other survivors already aboard. They extricated their friend Jim Vines's body from the river later that evening. Out of the 245 crew members on the DLB 269, 89 men were saved by the Captain John Tuggs. 5 men died, while 240 people lived. PTSD affected several of the soldiers. Later, the barge was raised again, towed into deeper water, and then buried again. Some people think the firm did that to avoid looking into the real reason for the sinking, despite the fact that the company claimed it was to remove the obstacle for the busy shipping region. After the quick decompression, some of the divers would never be able to dive again. Richard Lobb, the barge captain, carried on with his oil business. He accepted a senior management position in operations with a shore-based company. He now demands that before a significant storm, all of his vessels be pulled to safety. The aftermath of the rapid decompression left a lasting mark on some of the divers, closing the door to the deep blue sea forever.